Some weeks ago, when I first started preparing for this visit, I asked Dr. Gerstein who is the audience and how I should pitch the talk. And she said, prepare as if people know nothing about you. Say something about your past work and future ongoing projects, and then focus on the most recent book, The Global Heartland. Well, I did that. I followed that advice, and that's how I have organized my talk. But in the meanwhile, I know there is one thing that this audience knows now about me, and that is where I keep my passport. So at this occasion, what it has given you the opportunity of knowing one thing about me, that I keep it in the deep down underground banks. It has also reminded me of anxieties of people who have been removed from or have had to leave their country by force, and the insecurities that stay with those people. Alejandro Lugo, anthropologist, actually writes about it, and writes about people who are forced to leave their country. They never cross the borders. The borders stay with them always, and the anxieties of inspections, such as inspection of paperwork. And I think that is somehow might be able to explain why I keep my passport. I used to keep my passport, but I did. But my past personal, as a student activist and as a refugee in Norway, has not only shaped this incident, but also my scholarship, which I would like to share with you a brief overview. The kind of questions I ask and the methodologies I use. My work concerns how marginalized people produce dignified livelihood from below through interconnected local and global processes and practices. Specifically, I explore how the tensions between their citizenship practices and institutionalized policies, be it by state or by corporations, create opportunities to promote social justice. So that is broadly explaining what my work concerns and is about. My methodology is ethnographic. I ground my work in experience of people, be it marginalized informal settlements of Latin America or racialized townships of South Africa, or refugees and immigrants of Canada and United States. I group my publications in three areas, or thematically, if I want to group what I have been writing about, it groups in three areas. Urban governance, citizenship, and global inequalities. And I give you just a few sketches in each area. It's hard to summarize more than 20 years in a few minutes, but I give you a glimpse of them. And the keywords are appearing in each slide under each theme. So in this body of work, urban governance, I examine global policy prescriptions that shift responsibilities from the national to local governments and from the public sector to private and community organizations. And this shift and reconfiguration has been profound for emerging trends in governance, but also has had fundamental implications for planning, in particular what we call it entrepreneurial planning, a shift towards entrepreneurial planning. And I discuss it through a study of public-private partnerships, privatization, and creation of municipality, what I call it municipality incs, or municipality incorporations. In this other body of my work, which I call it citizenship, I am trying to I'm trying to understand the role of citizens' collective action for obtaining housing and basic services. I would say my contribution in this area has been more refining this relationship between citizen and state agencies. If my earlier, am I obstructing your view? If my earlier work concerned coping mechanisms of grassroots, my later work started looking at not only how grassroots cope with these policies, but how they resist unfair policies, right? Through protests or, struggle plumbers who were reconnecting water pipes that were water that was unfairly disconnected. So those movements or those practices of the grassroots to shape policies through resistance. And in my ongoing current project, funded project that I would share with you in a moment, I'm pushing it even one level further by looking at not only how they cope or resist, but how they shape an alternative future, which I call it a humane urbanism, right? How grassroots through their practices could create new forms of policies. So this work is formulated in building on the work of Leonie and John, among other prominent scholars, under the frame of insurgent planning practices. In body of work that I called Global Inequalities, I try to look at how the local and global contingencies in community development, right? How local and global are connected in processes of what we call it community development, in a way understanding the transnational dimension of community development processes. And my concern is both with inequalities that across the globe connect communities, as well as within the countries or within the cities, urban inequalities. And I see these as interconnected, as part and parcel of each other. I think the book that I will present now, my latest book, will very much exemplify this body of work. Okay, now I will give you a very brief overview of my current funded project and a couple of projects that are developing. I have a project that is funded by Mellon Foundation. It's a group, brings together a group of academics and activists, University of Illinois, myself and another couple of colleagues, plus University of Minnesota, but we are working together with so-called insurgent activists in South Africa, in Mexico City, and in Chicago. All of them are fighting against evictions, and as they exchange knowledge and produce knowledge from below, the idea of the project is that maybe we can have the beginning or the foundations for these alternative imaginations. In a way, it is an experimental project, and Mellon Foundation has been very supportive of seeing where it goes, but it's a way of decolonizing planning thought and seeing how we could produce knowledge that would be offer an alternative to the way in which we experience cities today and problems. The second project, which actually just last week we had the pleasure of hearing from SSHRC, Shirk, is a project that received support, $2.5 million, and it's led by Linda Peake at York University, but she has brought together a team of feminist scholars and activists, including myself as a co-applicant, and to study the role of gender insecurities and urbanization. So it's an attempt of re-theorizing urban through a feminist lens. And that one is, the formal announcement will go out in September. It was just, the decision was announced last week. And I leave you with the other ones. I want to just say a few words about the project that I see it as developing. I'm very excited about it, and I'm at very early stages of its development. It's looking at, if we think about the refugees and displaced populations, these are the fastest growing population in the world, and be it through climate change, due to climate change, or war and violence, or greed of real estate development. If we considered not but the climate change and war refugees and displaced populations based on definition of UN, that is the fastest growing population. And the question is, if we use that lens that we understand in governance and management of refugee camps, what I call it instant urbanization, how could that help us in understanding contemporary cities, where to a certain degree, the marginalized populations of cities, informal settlements, or be it, Southside Chicago, the unwanted, undesired populations, how could we understand the contemporary dynamics of our cities through the experience of refugee camps? So these are the experiences of displacement and emplacement, and I'm hoping to develop it for funders in European Union, which I think would be interested in that. Okay, if you were interested in hearing more about any of these projects, I will be happy to share with you more detail. In interest of time, I move to my book, Global Heartland. The title of the book, Global Heartland, is a play with two themes. It's a play on notion of heartland as being parochial and local in the sense of isolated from the global, and it's trying to, join the exciting scholarship that has been out there, problematizing, categorizing local and global as separate categories, and emphasizing or deepening the theorization of local and global as entangled and as being mutually constituted. So that is what the book sets for itself to do. It is also a play on global cities. We know so much about processes of globalization through the lens of metropolitan areas, right? Global city literature, it created a lot of knowledge and useful and important knowledge about how to place globalization in particular places, but it is always through the lens of metropolitan areas. So the metrocentrism of this scholarship, both of globalization and of planning, is what is problematic. And I try in this book to shift the gaze and ask, if we looked outside what the knowledge that we know about metropolitan areas and try to understand processes of globalization and placemaking, what do we see? What do we see by moving the gaze to the marginalized spaces or spaces that have been ignored or overlooked? In some way, you would say Global Heartland is about precisely those kind of communities that today we call them Trumplands, misunderstood by politicians, overlooked by scholars, and it seeks to understand what are the deeper understanding of these places. Okay, so let me introduce the town that is subject of this book, Beardstown, Illinois, in central Illinois. It's 4 hours drive from Chicago, if that is any point of reference. It is 6,000 people that live in it, and it's located in the breadbasket of the country in the middle of agricultural fields. And like many other Rust Belt communities, as you can see, in 1970s and 80s, it lost its industries. It was an industrial town, and most of its industries left, except for the last one that was a meatpacking plant, and Oscar Mayer. That one left in 1986. Swiftly after that, in a matter of few months, it was bought back, purchased by Cargill Corporation. Cargill, of course, could drop down the wages by $2.50 per hour. That is about 25% cut in the wages. The locals who were previously the main workers of the plant didn't want to accept these jobs, so the ones who could, they left, and the labor turnover of the plant was close to 100%. Of course, they reached out and brought in workers from outside the region and local area. They went out to border areas in Mexico. So in 2000, they brought in workers, Latin American, Spanish-speaking, predominantly Mexicans. By 2000, they brought in West Africans, French-speaking West Africans, predominantly Togolese. And in 2007, when the raids happened, they went after citizens or legal workers, and they brought in Puerto Ricans and African-American Detroiters. So the book is about how in this town, this process is reshaping the landscape of the town. What is important to know about Beardstown, Illinois, is that it was a sundown town. James Loewen called these towns in the north of U.S. that didn't want legally to have segregation. They wanted to enjoy labor force, but they didn't want to have them live amongst them and have their children go to the same school or be their neighbors. So they used to put signs like this, and Beardstown is one of those. At the turn of the century and even up to 1960s, oral history shows that they had signs like this outside the city premises, warning African Americans, don't let the sun set on you, and you have to leave before sunsets. And that is the name Sundown Town comes from. As recent as 1995 and 1996, Ku Klux Klan had its rituals, burning crosses, and even in downtown Beerstown Plaza, they burned a 6 feet tall cross, protesting Cargill bringing these diverse and non-white and non-native workers to town. So the question that I have been, I was mesmerized by when I started the project in 2005, and I stayed with it till the last field work was in 2013, and the book was out 2016. So you can imagine it was 10 years long obsession with trying to understand how does this process happen, right? This is one of the scenes from the September 16th Independence Day celebration by Mexicans inside Beerstown. How, first of all, where do these people come from? It's not like natural that people want to leave their country and go around the world in search of jobs at Cargill. What keeps them there that the previous working class, previous residents that worked in the plant don't want to accept or don't find these wages viable, but these people stay in? And how do they renegotiate such deeply racist, relationships? And how do they make a place in this context? Of course, the African proverb from Chinua Achebe's Arrow of the God was very influential for me. The world is like a mask dancing. If you want to see it, well, you do not stand in one place. And that's really what I had to do. In order to understand Beerstown, I couldn't understand it by just limiting myself to the territorial site that I was facing. I had to go to places where these people come from to understand the full picture. So by 2008, when I had trust enough of a Mexican worker, I went with her to Michoacan, where most of the Mexican workers come from. And in 2010, I went with one of the Togolese workers to her hometown and was able to follow these people. I think having done that, I want to share with you what I found up front, or what is what I hope that the book has been able to establish. Through a multi-scale or a multi-sited relational approach, I hope I was able, and the goal of the book is to expose relational, or to use a relational approach to expose two sets of relationships. One are relationships that connect Beerstown to the rest of the world, to the communities across the world, and the other one are a set of relationships that exist within Beerstown, amongst immigrant groups, amongst various racialized groups, and amongst locals and native-born and foreign-born. So one is the first, relationship with across the world with other communities. I hope would help us to denaturalize the movement of people across the world. What produces these workers, globally mobile workers? It's not. It just doesn't happen that people show up in Beerstown for work. There is a systemic processes of production of globally mobile workforce. That was what I hope I can show in the book. And secondly, what keeps them in these jobs is through a set of restructuring of social reproduction processes. In respect to what happens within Beerstown, I hope I can make visible those marginalized spaces, that if you only follow the narratives of Chicago's, New York's, and Los Angeles, we will think Beerstown is passive site of nothing happens. But when you go into minute interactions and dynamics, you will find different story. I will hope that I can, in the next 20 minutes, share that with you. So in terms of the first point, what brings these people here, in 3 chapters of the book, one is about Mexico and Togo, and the third one about Detroit, really is to talk about all of these workers are displaced workers. It's wrong to call them immigrant workers, because immigrant kind of has a connotation as if there was a voluntary movement there. And these people following, if you use concept of accumulation by dispossession, they have been dispossessed of their livelihoods, be it through NAFTA, be it through structural adjustment policies or other restructuring policies, dispossessed of their livelihood, and then what Saskia Sassen calls dislodged into labor markets, like the labor market of the US, and meatpacking plant industries that captures them. So it's important to understand that these are not immigrants, they are displaced workers that have been systematically produced through certain global policies. And that is the first point. I don't have time here to go into detail of it, but that's the part of the book that I hope you will have a chance to read. It's here if you wanted to browse through later on. Okay, then the second point that I raised in that by relational understanding what we see, and that I call it global restructuring of social reproduction. Let me, through the story of Mrs. Akofa and Mr. Comey, walk you through that concept. Most of the Togolese displaced workers in Beerstown working for Cargill have the similar story. They come in highly educated and through what is called diversity visa. Diversity visa is supposed to be lottery, random, but it gives point system based on education, and that's how it gets the most highly educated Togolese or recipients. So people in my survey in Beerstown, they were 85% of them had left their children behind. Part of their nuclear family was left behind, and 58% of them, that's about 60%, had 4 years of college or higher. I interviewed doctors, engineers, human rights lawyer, a sociology professor, mechanical engineer, you name it. These people were cutting meat in Cargill plant, and that I can explain later the mechanisms by which this process of siphoning or wasting brains happens. But the story of Mrs. Akofa is important here because she is one of those 85% that leave their nuclear family behind to be cared for by a sister, a mother, a friend, some other family member that takes care and nourishes their children that they leave behind when adults in the family move to US with this visa to work in places like Cargill at Beerstown. So the family of Mrs. Akofa is here in Togo. When I visited them, she is the daughter, and she was 8 years ago when the mom and dad moved to US. These two boys were ages 6 and 11, so she basically lost most of that precious time of seeing their children grow into young men. Okay, I want to now shift from Togo and the story of that one particular family to Michoacan and the story of this anecdote that I had in Michoacan at the main plaza of Tejaro, the town I was at. I approached these gentlemen, that is summer of 2008 when I was there, and asked them, how many of you have worked overseas, or in US, Al Norte? And out of 10, 9 of them said, I have worked in US. One of them had early Parkinson's disease, couldn't work anymore. One of them had damaged his back, was in construction work, couldn't do that anymore. One of them simply was too old to be picked up at the Menard and Home Depot parking lot for day laborer jobs. So they had sold the most productive segment of their life cycle in the labor market to employers in US. And when their bodies are injured, too tired or too old, they are sent back home or they are going back home to be cared for, not only by their families, but it's important to pay attention that there are public institutions, an army of NGOs and public institutions that both raise this labor force for our labor market. I would say US labor market, maybe Canada as well, and also labor, an army of institutions that receive them after they are no longer competitive in this labor market. So I use these two anecdotes or observations that I just shared with you to talk about what I call global restructuring of social reproduction. We know a lot about how production globally has been restructured by outsourcing segments of production to places that are cheaper and easier to be done. This is talking about outsourcing and offshoring part of the social reproduction, be it members of the family, like Akofa's family, that some members are offshored or outsourced their care work for them, or be it segments of the life cycle that is temporally and spatially restructured to be performed elsewhere. So the beginning of the life cycle and the end of the life cycle are performed elsewhere or offshored and outsourced. And that is what I talk about as global restructuring of social reproduction. Here in the book, I talk a lot that we shouldn't see it as only biological care work. It's also imagination of that elsewhere, all sorts of cultural motivations, but I cannot go into that. So I'm giving just this part of the story, not the how the role of imagining and elsewhere actually could motivate these people to endure jobs that neither the African Americans nor the Euro-Americans that were working at the plant could have benefit of this kind of strategies of restructuring their social reproduction. So this is very important in understanding and explaining that question of how come that most of the local native-born workers left these jobs in this industry, which is by far the most dangerous industry, and the counterparts, the foreign-born ones, would keep it or stay in it. Okay, I want to shift gear now to that second question I had. You remember I talked about what are the relationships that connects Beerstown to the rest of the world, and we saw both the how the displaced labor force is globally produced and globally socially reproduced. And then the second question was, what are the relationships within Beerstown, right? I have two chapters in the book that are one follows the other, and it's inspired by Max French sayings, the Swiss playwright that says, "We wanted workers, we got people." So the one chapter that is about we wanted workers is about dynamics of workplace within Cargill, how the OSHA regulations are cheated on, how workers are dehumanized by testimonials of workers about whether their work, injuries are being, basically Cargill gets away with murder, how sometimes they are made to work even and not given time to go and use the bathroom, so they are performing work as they are wet, and then are placed against each other. I call it choreography of assembly line. They put one English-speaking, one French-speaking, one Spanish-speaking, again English, Spanish, so that the workers cannot talk to each other and cannot organize, cannot have any possibility, also to create these tensions between them and stereotypes and all the literature that we know about labor segmentation and dynamics of workplace. So what I want to move from is that if I look only at the workplace, I would end up with one story. But when I shifted my gaze to look at outside the workplace, I saw a set of other kinds of dynamics that I couldn't resist to look further into or ignore, right? And that was what is happening on day-to-day practices of people. As in the workplace, these workers are being dehumanized through practices and policies of the corporation, right? How outside the workplace, they build relationships that I call them humanizing relationships, how they interact with each other and create a different story that I call it they wanted workers, they got people kind of story. So let me first walk you through some of the observations, and then I come back to this. When you walk around Beardstown, you don't see segregated neighborhoods. There is no black neighborhood, Latino neighborhood, poor neighborhood, rich neighborhood, because it is a blue-collar industrial company town. Everybody more or less has the same wages, and there was no previously black and white and Latino neighborhood, considering everybody who was not white was zoned out. When they arrived, they were dispersed out everywhere in all areas. And mobile homes are not segregated in mobile parks. Mobile home parks, they are in the back of every Victorian house, every spot you can find it, and they are not limited only to the newcomers. They are by native born. It's a complete mix. So we calculated what is called the index of dissimilarity, and the index of dissimilarity for Beardstown is lower than, of course, Chicago is segregated, so it doesn't count, but lower than many other metropolitan areas that we know as being hubs of immigrants, Los Angeles, New York, etc. We come across the school that is brand new. While all the other towns closed down their schools, in Beardstown you have a brand new built school, but a school that is offering dual language program. I don't know what is the equivalent of that for Canadians, but dual language program is different from ESL, or English language as second language. They don't draw out those kids that are not English speaking to separate classes. They rather offer 50% of each curriculum material, 50% in English, 50% in Spanish. That means all those white supremacist Beardstownians who didn't want to have, non-whites as their neighbors, now they have their children coming home with half of their science assignment in Spanish, right? This is pretty bold program that not many metropolitan cities, areas have been able to adopt it. And here you have a rural school district adopting dual language program. I don't think Champaign has it either. The library has programming and book offering services in 3 languages, and so is sports, is the sports that they play. They have instituted or created soccer and 11 soccer leagues that are multiracial. They didn't go into the melting pot of playing baseball or American football. They created soccer and brought in the Africans, and Mexicans who started it, brought in the French-speaking, and now increasingly the Euro-American high schoolers. They started celebrating Cinco de Mayo and Independence Day indoors in the school. For the Africans, it was the basement of the local bank, etc. But as recent as 2013 and 2014, they used to every year celebrate these marching and taking over the public spaces. I should just make a footnote. This year, with the fear that Trump and all of that have created, they canceled the Cinco de Mayo, so they are not going to do it. So this is a very different era and climate. But observing these things for me was important, questioning, if we look beyond the workplace and formal politics, what do we see? Outside the workplace, different reality hits us. There are what Leone calls 1,000 tiny empowerment, I would call it 1,000 tiny interactions on day-to-day basis, based on these groups that are racialized and dehumanized through our immigration policies, labor practices, and labor policies. But they find themselves and they find ways in which they can reclaim their humanity. And this is not done through formal electoral politics. The mayor is bigoted and white supremacist. The city aldermen, they are all native-born, English-speaking Euro-Americans. So there you do not see any sign of change. But outside the formal politics, you see these changes happening. School has been fundamental in transitioning in processes of Beardstown. And that was not something that the superintendent or the school district by decree provided. Teachers went out like army of cultural change and negotiations. They said that one summer, they used sometimes one whole evening with one family, convincing them that it's not bad for your child to speak to learn Spanish at school, both for Spanish-speaking families and English-speaking families. They were resistant to it. So these were the teachers that used that summer to talk one by one by one by one and make that understanding happening. It was, it of course helps that it was a small town. There was one school only, so they couldn't say, okay, I don't want this school, I take my kids to another school that is, creates this white and non-white school. The fact that it was a small town that was sundown town, its racist history to in certain degree shaped the fact that when the plant brought these diverse people, they got spread out all over. And the soccer was something that was 10 years really, long years of people playing in the backyards, in the, abandoned lots till they managed to claim a land and clean it and manage it and support, basically take it over. So what I talk about is that if we looked from the perspective of what we know, the narratives of immigration mobilization, we look at Birsam, we would not, how would I say it? You don't see immigrant marches in Beerstown. Nobody would dare to march because it's a single employer, there is no anonymity, and people don't want to lose their jobs, right? So you would not have the possibility of having the kind of militancy, the kind of activism that we hear about in global cities. And if we went from that lens, looking at this place, we would say it's only a space of global capital exploitation and nothing more. There is a space of despair. I do not challenge, and in the chapter that I talk about the industry and its practices, I do not challenge that reality, how these are super exploited workers. But what I'm adding to it is that while at the workplace they are dehumanized, right? Outside the workplace, they still assert their agency, their humanity by finding each other. So if men found each other and solidarity through soccer fields, women and men through home-based childcare practices, they have been able to reconnect and know each other in a different way than than the way that is in the workplace. Okay, and I want to, in interest of time, to leave time for discussion, I want to just summarize in going back to what we talked about. If we looked through a relational framing, we will see the local and global entanglements. We will see several, analytical closures we are able to avoid. We don't separate global production of labor force from global social reproduction of labor force. We don't separate local economic development from global underdevelopment of other communities. And also we will see that each place in its own right would have its own politics, the place-based politics and materiality of place. What I mean by materiality of place is that it's not only its social history of, history of labor and race. So it's not only its social and its position in relations of capitalism, but it's also those physical characteristics, if you want to call it, that come to picture to create certain place and the kind of politics. And we have to recognize the opportunities and constraints that each place produces and recognize them in their own right. How we frame the stories we tell matters, and this is the concluding statement I just want to read from the text. How we frame the stories we tell matters, and those frames depend on what we put in the center and what we put on the margin, on what we give voice and what we silence. Global Heartland's relational account of local economic revitalization in the Heartland deeply challenges what we celebrate as success in our planning education. Moreover, it challenges what we see and what we make invisible or visible. In this story, displaced people, despite the formal institutionalized policies and practices, not because of it, but despite those, were able to, despite the national immigration policies and labor practices and policies, they make place and produce their dignified livelihood and their humanity. As planning educators, the stories we tell about places and processes that shape them matter in the kind of policies and plans we produce and promote. In particular, in these dark political times when white supremacists not only rule in the US, but have power to rule the world and seek to enforce policies that spread hate, build walls, and dehumanize disadvantaged people, we carry, I would say, a heavy and critical responsibility on our shoulders as educators in general and as planning scholars in particular, to recognize how planning questions are deeply ethical and political questions, and to decolonize planning as make visible people's everyday placemaking as also forms of planning, as citizens planning. And if I fail to say that, it's basically the project brings to light the global nightmares that are involved. If this was an American dream that people talk about it, this also helps us to understand the global nightmares on which the American dream rests, the global inequalities that make for the story, but also at the same time, how people assert their agency and their humanity. So it's trying to capture both the tension and both aspects of the complex story that makes for Birstan. I leave the last few minutes for questions. Thank you so much.
So it's a great, it's a fantastic story. It's a remarkable and unique story that you're trying to put together. And maybe you can say a few words about the effect on the home communities in Togo, Togo and in Michoacan village or town.
Sure. Michoacan, really, when we arrived there, I have an image I could share with you, which captures the kind of ghost town. You know, these are towns that are the life and labor and youth, young has been sucked out of them. So much of Michoacan that now has become the prey of, you know, narco traffics, etc., is like towns like Tejaro, that it has some older people and some younger people, but that middle group, the youth at the economically active age group, don't exist, and that is the reality of these towns. So I talk about it in the book, that how revitalization of the Rust Belt is resting on ghostification of towns in Mexico. So in a lot of narratives of the locals often is about, you know, what we hear with Trump supporters, that they are sucking out our resources in US, they are siphoning out our resources, sending money home to, improve their communities of origin. What we don't see is the other flow of resources, the resources in kind that is not only the labor force that comes and revitalizes our communities, but also the other support system. So yeah, it is the effect, you have a lot of buildings that are built, and it's a lot published about, how these mansions are being built through remittances that go home. But those mansions and houses that are built not often are occupied for long stretches of time, are people who are working and are staying in the US, sending money home, hoping that they will return. Sometimes they return, sometimes they don't. But it's a bunch of solid structures, but no people yet, because they are all back in US. So if that helps with answering that question. In Togo, much of the remittances was going for support of family they have left behind, or the network of family that depends on them. So the remittances are, in a way, the social policy It's a healthcare system, it's a retirement system, it's all of those policies that were cut through structural adjustment, etc., now are supported through remittances that are sending home. So it's helping to keep these families, afloat. Yes.
It's fascinating stuff. So, did you see, according to the differences in immigration status, did you see substantial differences in, say, the structure of their family units, how much of it was with them, and in the structure of their finances in terms of maybe remittances, cash flow back and forth, things like that?
The Togolese, I call it Togolese because at the time majority of the West Africans were Togolese, but that stands for, they were from a range of countries from Central and West Africa, French-speaking Africa. So the majority of them were legal. There were few undocumented West Africans, and just 3 weeks ago I helped to do a workshop, Know Your Rights, because there is a lot of atmosphere of fear now. So we did a workshop of, and apart from the undocumented Mexicans who came to the workshop, there were a few West Africans who came. So that was clear indication that some of the West Africans are also undocumented. Maybe they came through other countries or however. So, but majority are legal, they have green card and work permit for the West Africans. The Spanish-speaking, which by and large are Mexicans, are many of them, I would say, are undocumented. How that affects their position vis-a-vis work, I would want to answer that question before the next one. One thing that is important is that if the Mexicans, because of their legal status, because they're undocumented, are chained to these backbreaking, they call it the 3Ds, difficult, dangerous, and dirty work that, people don't want to, most workers don't want to do it for that compromise, for that lower wages. If the Mexicans are, because of their legal status, are chained to the work, are enslaved to the work, you could call it, the West Africans, although they have document legal status, the debt they incur to make it to places, to US, even though it's through diversity visa and the whole thing is legalized, they each have to incur $4,000 debt for each family member to come. So you can imagine if a family of 4 or 3 even if they leave all the little ones behind, they still have to borrow, and lend from loan sharks in the number around $15,000. So they get chained to the factory first because they don't know language. Then we have an imperial educational system that we don't recognize their credentials. And thirdly, because they have to start paying back money to the sometimes 100, 200, $300% interest rate that is accumulating on the money they loan. So that becomes their incarceral relations. That becomes what enslaves these highly educated West Africans, despite their immigration status, to these works and makes it difficult for them to move. That was the question, or
also the way they structure their family life in terms of how many people are living in the U.S. versus at home, and their finances in terms of how much of the compensation they're getting is going to.
It varies. For the West Africans, I was, it could be something depending on how much, how early it is, how much they have incurred debt. It could be something, if there are 2 working people, they could sometimes send as much as $800, $900 home. Some of it goes for support of family. Bulk of it could go for the money they have borrowed. The Mexicans don't have that, huge amount of debt that they have to settle. So they pay some money for, crossing the border, but that is not the main source of why they send money home. They send lower amounts. There are also more of them. So if you have a family, there might be 3 children, 5 people who are sending money home, so they can send smaller amounts. While for West Africans, if there is one that works in Europe or in US, that is, there are not 5 of them sending money home. So it is a bigger burden on them. Nora, and then...
I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Sure.
I'm When you were talking about the global restructuring of social reproduction, I'm reminded of the parallel lives of international domestic workers in the global care economy. And I was curious, became more curious, as if you could speak more on the labor recruitment strategy.
Yeah.
And what's the role of the city, I guess the state and the federal government, as well as the corporation itself, and how, if there's a kind of an intergenerational transmission now of the work practices, if there would be that second layer of displaced workers or the children of the migrants who are now feeling the need for new workers.
First question was labor recruitment strategies. The very first move by Cargill was they sent what we call it, they call it mobile recruiters. So it's a van, has a company nurse, HR person, and a driver. They drove to the border area. Some of the interviewees were saying that they were on the other side of border, but that is not confirmed, so by and large on the US side of border. And they test your wrists, your back, and urine for, drugs or whatever. If you're strong and can do the work, they give you a one-way ticket to get to Beerstown. It's not a gift. They will pick it up from your paychecks. So that would be deducted later on. So if you, this was the first, round of recruitment that directly they sent mobile recruiters. When they started recruiting in Detroit and in the island in Puerto Rico, it was the same thing. The one Detroiter plus the nurse and HR person go and they do that same transaction, one-way ticket, and then they. This was the early, with the Mexican workers. They did it early on, but then, there is a long literature on this, how the network, the social network then kicks in. Then Cargill didn't have to recruit anymore. They offered bonuses. They offered, it varies based on how much they're desperate for workers and also who the worker is. Interestingly, the bonus for a French-speaking West African worker was $300. I heard, as much as $300 people were paid if they bring a relative, a friend, a new worker to the company. For Mexicans, around $50 to $100. So the bonus system that the workers themselves recruit from their network. That is how it is done. And then the transnational care work. The feminist literature, work of Ali Hochschild and Parenius and yourself, it has documented this transnational care work that is performed across the globe. But here we are not talking about the domestic worker that is taking care of a family and leaving her own child behind to be cared by others. We are talking about multinational industrial corporations that are tapping into these strategies of transnational care work. So that is kind of like...
What happened to the children, the earlier workers?
Some of them join the labor force. They become the new labor force for the plant. Some of them, interestingly enough, I see among many of them joining the army as a secure way of getting education, etc. And very few, I shouldn't say that because I haven't really systematically surveyed, but I'm just giving observations. But both ways. But I haven't studied that.
I'm sorry, we have to.
Sure, I would be happy to discuss later on as we meet.
We're running a very tight ship here.
Yeah, sure.
Well, thank you so much for this.
Thank you.